Hello, my name is Pierce Gannon, and for Principles of Ecology Module 1, I chose to do my presentation on the primary succession of mycorrhizal fungi. The role of mycorrhizal fungi in normal ecosystems is mostly mutualistic, but sometimes parasitic in high nutrient environments. But in low nutrient environments, such as those present in successionary stages, it's going to be almost exclusively mutualistic. Their role is that they bind to the plant roots and they give them water, nitrogen, and phosphorus, essential nutrients that they use during photosynthesis and other processes, in exchange for carbohydrates and carbon sources that are used for energy. This increases the plant productivity and gives the fungus a place to live. In addition to that, it also increases the soil fertility by cycling these essential nutrients to the plants and back to the soil. This can be seen through bacteria that is present within the fungi, such as nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and microorganisms that solubilize phosphate. There are two major types of mycorrhizal fungi. There's ectomycorrhiza and endomycorrhiza. Different fungus have different properties, so not all fungus will be able to colonize, not all will be able to do some things that others will. For example, some can help remove toxic soil elements, such as chromium or radioactive elements, through a process called bioremediation. But these two types of fungus have the same generalized function. They both help plants in exchange for the plants helping them. Their differences come in their abundance in nature, where endomycorrhiza form root relationships with about 85% of plants, and they're going to be referred to as arbuscular mycorrhiza, or AM. They form their relationships by encasing the root or parts of the root with their fungus networks, whereas ectomycorrhiza form their relationships by penetrating the root cells. So instead of just encasing, they're more directly in there. Those are going to be referred to as ECM or EM in this presentation, and they form root relationships with about 10% of plants. So there's a little bit of overlap there. Now, in the background, you'll see a oversimplified graphic about the stages of succession. And now you can see in primary succession, which is denoted on the left by the 1, it's just going to be rock. It's going to be super barren, no soil, nothing like that. So primary occurs first in areas without any life, and it often takes a long time before any life is seen. This, like shown on the screen, is areas of high volcanic activity, so volcanic deserts or newly formed islands, in addition to places where the ground has seen no activity for a long time, like glacier melts. When they recede, the ground underneath won't have anything on it. This is not to be confused with secondary succession, which can result from natural disasters like tornadoes or hurricanes. And the difference here is that in secondary succession, the life may not be directly visible in the form of trees or flowers, things like that, but microscopic organisms and soil are still present. So it makes it much easier for life to integrate into that system. Now, an important question to ask is, why does succession occur? It is a natural process that occurs as an ecosystem ages, and it happens because organisms make an impact on the area as they exist. There's a redistribution of organic and inorganic materials, such as those seen in nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, things like that. And that paves the way for future species that are better suited for the new environment that has been formed by these older ones. Now, some organisms are better suited for these primary successionist areas, and these are called either ruderal or pioneer species due to their ability to easily move in and kind of take over in their niche. As the environment changes, so do the plants and animals most suitable to inhabit it. Now, there are some limitations to succession because some areas may be inaccessible or some organisms may be better suited to access them. These organisms must be succeeded by others, and these organisms have to be able to reach these habitats in order to succeed the others. There are limitations in the form of dispersal. So nearby populations, say on a nearby island or in an area just outside the impacted area, they may not be able to easily move in and take over. However, there's also survivability limitations, and we saw this in lecture 3. Some species are easily able to move, but they're not easily able to survive in these barren and kind of harsh environments. An example of this is in volcanic areas, heavier seeds may be more secure and more survivable, but they're less mobile. Some things like coconuts are very easily moved in certain areas, but they're not always going to survive where they land. This variability is in the form of trade-offs. So some things may be better suited for dispersal and some things may be better suited for survivability. The first study that I looked at was about fungal colonization of the Mount Fuji volcanic deserts over in Japan. So after the 1707 eruption of the volcano, there was a large volcanic desert area where life took a long time to move in. And now this study was performed in 2003, and it involved assessing the above ground mushroom production, what we see as mushrooms, as well as the below ground mycorrhizal networks in these deserts, or areas where the vegetation can form in these deserts. These were identified based on vegetation plot size, so they could kind of tell how old these areas were based on how much soil there was and how big the plants were that had moved in. So there were some areas that were obviously much younger and some areas that were obviously much older. So they got to see it on a different spatial timescale. They did this by weekly counting and assessment of the fruiting bodies of the ectomycorrhizal or ECM fungus for 2 years in the vegetation patches. They compared these below and above ground ECM patches in order to determine the species richness, so how many species of fungus had moved in and the variety that was present, as well as the community structure, so how things interacted in their primary succession. It hadn't been studied much up until this point, so this was a good opportunity to assess how these things happen. And in the background, you'll see that's a picture of Mount Fuji itself. The initial colonization patterns, sometimes spore banks were present before plants had arrived, and they lay dormant in the ground. But these ones were thought to have been airily deposited. So they were deposited either by wind or by other methods through the air, and they lay dormant until the arrival of suitable host plants, so plants that they could make relationships with in the soil. Their surveys showed that there were a few species that colonized it well due to their dispersal abilities of their spores. And now these are ruderal species, so plant species that moved in early. And the fungi can't exist on its own, so they had to have laid dormant up until that point. They weren't able to take over and then once the plants came, they were able to thrive more. That's not the case. Because they focused heavily on reproduction, though, they weren't necessarily the most competitive species. They paved the way for the more competitive species to arrive later by mediating more favorable soil conditions. So, by cycling the nutrients and creating a larger buildup of these organic and inorganic materials in the soil, the later species that arrived were able to do much better. The successional patterns shown were that after the initial colonization, the Rudale species are replaced by more competitive species. So, species that are more effectively able to transfer resources to the plant and more easily able to receive resources from the plants moved in later once it was a little bit easier for them to do so. The above ground sporocarps, or the visible mushrooms, were reported to be larger when connected with plants with higher photosynthetic rates. And the photosynthetic rates increased with nitrogen and phosphorus content in the host plants. So this association leads us to the conclusion that the healthier plants correlated positively with the healthier fungi. So as the fungi did better, the plants did better, and they both continued to thrive more. The next study was not about volcanic activity and the volcanic deserts, but it was about an artificial island situated between Denmark and Sweden. So they formed this island by dredging up soil or things from underneath the ocean, and they left it as it is to study it from an ecological standpoint, how things would succeed primarily on this island, which was about 1 kilometer away from the other island, which was there before. So the island that was created is called Peberholm. I hope I'm saying that right. And the island that was already there is called Saltholm. So you'll see Saltholm on the left, and you'll see Peberholm on the right. And Peberholm was built to act as a contact point between a bridge that you'll see leading over to the mainland and a tunnel that leads under. So this study compares the developing ecosystem of Peberholm, which was artificially constructed, with the neighboring island of Saltholm, which already had established organisms and an established ecosystem. It compared their species richness, community structure, and heterogeneity of the developing fungal community as well as the rest of the community on the artificial island. So the differences and similarities to the first study that was covered, Mount Fuji is not quite as isolated as Peberholm due to it being on the mainland of Japan. So there were areas where the volcanic area was right next to, like right up against the surrounding areas which still had life, whereas in Peberholm, it was just the ocean. So things would have to cross that 1 kilometer gap in order to colonize Peberholm. Both studies offer unique insights into the role of mycorrhiza in primary succession, albeit they do it a little bit differently, but they both do. The Peberholm study focuses mainly on AM fungi, while the Mount Fuji study focuses mainly on the ECM fungi. So while there's not too much difference between them, they are focused on slightly different types. So the early colonizers, they found that the first species to colonize Peberholm were the Rudale species, which was also found in the Mount Fuji study. Although they exhibited low competitiveness, they're extremely well suited for dispersal. So that seems like the common ground between most of these Rudale species, where they tend to focus more on dispersal rather than being competitive. So while they may not be great in their normal homes, they would be extremely good at spreading and taking over and making these habitats more suitable for later organisms. And like mentioned before, this is a big trade off. So they choose to do this method of dispersal so that they can establish early dominance. So this is the homogeny that's seen on the island during the early stages. Now we have other factors at play here. The fungi were later replaced as nutrients became more available and species richness increased. One potential theory for this is that geese, as shown in the picture in the background, brought the spores on them or in their poop to help further diversify the population of fungi. So because these fungi weren't able to colonize by wind, they may have hitched a ride over there. But this also could have been explained in that the geese that are roosting on the island, because their droppings showed similar fungi abundances to those of the soil, it could have potentially mean that the ruderal species colonized one little area first, and then the geese spread those around Peterholm. Now, which these is, they're both theories, and neither of them were strictly confirmed, but they're just some things to think about. Now, the conclusion is that both ECM and AM fungi play a very important role in the early colonization and formation of primary succession habitats. So these ruderal species, which are well suited for dispersal but not super competitive, help to change the soil content and the plant areas to be better suited for later organisms. And this is just their role in primary succession, which helps it succeed onward. And then I do have my sources right here. I use 3 articles. Thank you for watching my presentation, and I hope you have a nice day.